So welcome to this first session in this event, In Search of Adela Curtis, a modern mystic. And this first session, we're going to explore her childhood, which I called a fractured childhood. And I hope that will become clear as I sort of talk about her childhood experiences as to what I'm referring to. I guess, so this isn't just sort of a history lesson, which is interesting in itself, but also I think this is quite significant in relation to how she is as an adult, what happened to her as a childhood and how she interpreted what happened and how that interpretation changed over her life. So to begin with, I thought let's fill you in with her family. She was one of a large family. She was her mother's 7th child. Her mother would have 10 children altogether. And her mother is Harriet Vaughan here. She had been, by the time that she married Adela's father, she was 22, she was already a widow with a young child. So she'd been married before, and she had a little daughter called Eliza Emma by the time that she married William Curtis in 1857. And they were both 22. So for the first 6 years of their marriage, they lived in Southampton. This was the place where Harriet had grown up. So just to say, that's Harriet, the big picture, and that's her a few years later, and that's with her 2 oldest sons, so Alfred on the left and George on the right. So in Southampton, the family, she had her mother and her stepfather, Joseph, living nearby. And William also had 2 of his brothers and their families living nearby. So you can imagine that there was quite a lot of family support for the family in Southampton. William so this is William, Adela's father. He and his 2 brothers, all of whom lived in Southampton at this time, were ship stewards. He was a ship steward with the P&O line, and the relationship between Southampton and P&O is really interesting in that it was P&O was this shipping company that went around the world taking mail and some passengers to start with, and they were based in Southampton, and it was through P&O that Southampton grew. Lots of people from Southampton, they moved to Southampton to get work with P&O, and it led to the new parts of the city being built. And in these early days of the family being based in Southampton, so this is the road that they lived in. This is Padwell Road. I don't know exactly the number of the house they lived in, but these houses here on this side of the road are still the originals, built in the early 1860s. So they were living in a new house, and as their family was growing, William must have been doing quite well because they had 2 live-in servants by the early 1860s. So another thing to consider is that William would have been away for months at a time on the boat, but at least Harriet had her mother and stepfather close by. So Adela's mother, Harriet, had a poverty-stricken upbringing herself. Her father had died when she was 5. Her mother had to take in washing, to keep the family going until she remarried. So we could imagine that, living in a new house with live-in servants, her husband, although he was away a lot, was clearly doing quite well financially. We could imagine that this was quite a stable period for the family. But that was disrupted for Harriet and the family in around 1864. These are almost certainly the first 4 of Harriet's children. So Emma Eliza is the big girl, so she's the child that she had with her first husband. And then there's Clara, who we will hear more about, certainly tomorrow, is the little one. And then there's Alfred and George. And then there was another child, Walter. So that was the size of the family, 5 children, when this disruption happened, because clearly William was an ambitious young man. You might have thought he would be happy with the way things were, but he was clearly someone who was willing to take risks and start new ventures. And through his travels with P&O, he would have come to have heard about the new markets that were opening up in the Far East, and particularly with Japan. For centuries, Japan had been a country that had been isolated. It had isolated itself from the West. It had contact with the Western world in the sort of up to about the 1500s, and then it had had no contact, shut down all contact completely with the West. So it had had this isolationist policy. But then in the 1850s, the American fleet put pressure on Japan to open up. Basically, they wanted more places to do trade with. It was it's all about the West and the capitalism wanting to find new ways of trading, new markets, new ways of making more money. So the Japanese reluctantly signed a treaty that opened up its borders in a very limited way, but it allowed people from the West to start trading. William had grown up in an inn in Gravesend. His father had run a pub, the Rum Puncheon, in Gravesend, right by it's in Kent. It's right by the side of the Thames. He and his brothers would have grown up with his father running this pub really quite successfully for a number of years. And then his father took a risk, pulled down the old building, had it rebuilt, had a big new dining area built. And Gravesend in those days was very busy. There'd be people, a very busy port, coming and going. And so William would have experienced his father having great success, getting a lot of people in. Unfortunately, his father, because of the risk he took with doing the rebuilding, he'd gone bankrupt and the family had fallen apart. But I can imagine that that William wanted to do, follow in his father's footsteps, but continue to be successful. And what he did was, he was one of the first to relocate to Yokohama. That was the treaty port where the Westerners were allowed to reside, and he bought a hotel. I'm sure he was building on his experience of growing up in the pub in Gravesend, thinking, well, I can do as well as Dad, if not better. This is a picture of the plan of Yokohama, just about the time that he would have gone there. So this, before the West was involved in Japan, Yokohama was just a little fishing village. By the time that William and the family arrive, it's this much larger place. So this green block here. This is the Japanese block, where the Japanese live. This is where the Westerners are allowed to live, and that blue there, I'm fairly certain that that's where the commercial hotel was that William bought. He was just the second owner of it, and that's where the family went to live. This is before Adela has been born. So they've got 5 children. And family law does say that William Curtis did make fortunes, but he did lose them as well. So, and money in Adela is always an interesting question. Where did she get her money from? Is a really interesting question. And later he'd take on another hotel, and he'd also be a businessman dealing in food, including ham. And he is the sort of family law. Well, and also one of the ham making producers in Japan still links back how they learnt how to make ham from William Curtis, Adela's father. You know, he was an entrepreneur, a risk taker. Yes, an interesting person. We'll hear more. So, in about 1864, before Adela is born, the Curtis family become pioneers. They were some of the very first Westerners to go to Japan and to set up as traders. What happened about the children? So what happened was, and I think this is because probably the parents were ambitious for their children, and there would have been very little opportunities for education in Yokohama. You could imagine, you know, it was all very sort of rough and ready. So it ended up with the splitting up of the family unit, and certainly the boys, the older boys, Alfred and George, were placed in a boarding school. And Alfred writes about this, you know, remembers this when he writes to one of his sisters later in life, being put in a boarding school in Southampton, and it's likely that the girls would have as well. It's possible that it was just little Walter, who was a toddler, who went out with his mother to Yokohama. So right from the start, it means that the family's split up. And Clara, the little girl, writes later that from then on, that they never were all in the same place at the same time. It meant frequent trips for Harriet and for some of the children, and in those early days, that trip could take between 4 and 6 months. It wasn't just being in the boat, it was also, it was before the Suez Canal, or they weren't allowed to go through the Suez, so the people had to get out and go across land and get back in the boat. It was all very convoluted. So it was a huge thing. This disruption, you know, it was not only were they halfway around the world, it was half a year away if they needed to get back. And this was the family pattern from now on. In a way, I feel those older children had the advantage because their very earliest years had been stable in Southampton. The ones, including Adela, who were born in Yokohama, I think they suffered more. We'll see anyway. Other things to mention in the map. So the church, Christ Church, and we'll see some pictures of that in a minute, that's here. This is the orange. So funnily enough, right next to the commercial hotel. What else is there? Oh yes, so the water. This is the water here. This is the sea. And the sea would have been full of ships, Western ships protecting the Westerners doing their trade. And this is where the British troops were based. They were here for 10 years from the earliest times, And every Sunday they would march through Yokohama to the church for church parade. So it was a very military sort of feel to the place. And there is an extraordinary book that I found where people who had been in Yokohama in the very earliest days, 50 years later, they gathered their reminiscences together. And so one of the early residents described Yokohama as being like a large international military camp, the presence of British and French military forces here being due to the antipathy displayed towards foreigners by the Japanese. So I've got a picture of the US troops. I couldn't find one of British, but interestingly, this looks more like a Japanese picture, doesn't it, of the American troops. But so there would have been troops everywhere in Yokohama. And that antipathy led the British consul to give a public warning in Yokohama. It is desirable that the greatest caution and prudence be observed by British subjects in visiting the surrounding country. So the treaty had been drawn up in 1858. This is the 1860s. The treaty allowed foreigners to travel within a 30-mile area beyond their settlement, but it was clearly proving dangerous to do so. So, and another resident who arrived in 1869 did not like the town, writing about its roads and its ugliness, which were like those of an American prairie or an Australian bush town. This book also says that in the earliest days there were probably 100 Western men and maybe 10 Western women. So we can imagine that arriving and thinking that you're going to have your children here is pretty difficult. So this is the extraordinary. We've got this very old picture of Yokohama. We're supposed to be able to see the roof of the Christ Church, which was the English church, Anglican church that was built in the early 1860s. It's probably that. But if we're thinking that that was the church, then possibly one of these roofs is of the hotel where the Curtis family are now living. I mean, quite thrilling, really, to see a picture that old. And then this is, again, it's rather faint, isn't it? But this is a picture of the church. I mean, it's very faint, but it's here. So it was built inside, with a lich gate, of course. The idea was that the inside and the outside would help the English people living in Yokohama to feel like they were back home. And there's the interior. The church had done a little booklet. So Christ Church, which is the church in Yokohama, because of various fires and earthquakes and things, it isn't the same building, but they put this little booklet together at the centenary of the church, and they allowed me to use the photos, which is really good. But of course, you might be able to pretend in the church that you're back home, but being outside is anything but. Complete contrast to what might have been experienced in the UK. You have the hostility that the Japanese feel towards you being there, and the hostility is particularly because of the Christian faith. That was why they'd expelled the Westerners all those centuries ago, because they had feared that the missionaries were somehow softening them up to sort of be at a disadvantage with the West. So in all the towns in Japan, there were these signs that said Christianity is forbidden. So there were still some secret Japanese Christians, and when they saw that the Westerners were allowed to have a church, unfortunately, the secret Japanese Christians thought, we can be more open now, but thousands of them were deported because they were expressing their Christian faith. So it was a fraught place to be in many ways. And I have a picture of the first chaplain. You can guess which one he is. He's the white guy at the back on the left. The Reverend Michael Buckworth Bailey. He certainly baptised Adela's next, immediately older son. James was the first son of Harriet and William to be born in Yokohama. He was baptised in the church by the Reverend Buckworth Bailey. And almost certainly Adela, who was the next child, would have been too. But unfortunately, all the church records were destroyed in a fire in 2007. I couldn't believe it. So, we're getting the picture. It's quite a fraught place. I expect William was okay. You know, he was doing what he felt he was meant to be doing, running a hotel, making money. We'll see how the others felt. As I said, James was their first baby to be born in Yokohama in the hotel in 1866 in March. Later that year, in November, there was a catastrophic fire in Yokohama. It started in the Japanese town and spread into part of the Westerners' side. So the black bits are these bits. This is all the parts that were destroyed by the fire. I mean, everything was, in those days, it was all wooden buildings. So a bit like it made me think of the fire of London. You know, one starts, a breath of wind, and the whole thing just goes up. So it's not the whole of the town, you can see. And actually, so the church wasn't touched. The commercial hotel, I'm sure, wasn't touched. But just to add to the ghastly situation, so the situation was made far worse by the actions of the British troops, who were there to protect the people, enable them to do their trade. So the Swiss consul wrote in his diary that the behaviour of the English soldiers of the garrison, which at that time was the 9th Norfolk Regiment, was appalling. The city was actually in a state of pillage by the soldiers. They forced their way into houses everywhere, drank like pigs, and plundered whatever they could lay their hands on. I can't begin to imagine what it would have been like. Even if your house wasn't burnt down, these soldiers who were meant to be protecting you had a field day. And it was just a year later that Adela was born, in 1867. And then another son, Frederick, in 1869. It may be just a coincidence, I might be reading too much into it, but you remember we had those pictures of the older children as young children. We don't have any of James, Adela, Frederick, or Edwin. None of them turned up as young children. I just wonder whether, you know, that is just an indication of the way that, well, Yokohama was a much, you know, more primitive place for them to live. Quite dangerous, it seems to me, and quite an unwelcoming place for young children. And also, so in this sort of memorial book, thinking back 50 years, someone remembered the Curtis Hotel as a third-rate establishment. So I wonder what kind of home it was. So a bit of background, which I feel is really significant. You know, this is the kind of situation that Adela is born into. I just want to explore with you 3 incidents, 3 glimpses of her as a young child. Well, they're interesting, and I think that offer some significant sort of glimpses into her development. So the first one is when she's aged 3. And there is a scrap of paper, it's just enough for her. Perhaps she wrote other things as well, and she just cut this out. I don't know, but it's in her handwriting. And on this scrap of paper that Adela wrote as an adult, there's one sentence about her first visit to England, that she was brought to Southampton by P&O liner at 3 years of age. And this corresponds with the entry where I found her on the census in Southampton in 1871, where indeed she is 3 and her little brother Frederick is 1. And it shows that they're living in one of these cottages, which is still there. This is in Southampton. And it's literally, do you remember that earlier picture of Padwell Road? It's literally round the corner from Padwell Road. So when Adela is 3 and her little brother Frederick is 1, they're living in one half, I don't know which half, of these cottages, but not with their family. She and her infant brother were nurse children to Mary Ann Barrett, whose husband was a baker employed by P&O. And as I've already said, Adela remembered being left behind. This is one of the stories that she told her nieces, Phil and Eve, who lived with her here from the 1920s, and they continued to live in London after that. And she told them about, this is one of the few stories that she told about her early life. She remembered being left behind to live with foster parents, a deeply religious evangelical family, as she called them, in Southampton. I can imagine that Harriet has had these children in boarding schools in Southampton that she hasn't seen for a number of years. She's got other children, little boys, who would be ready for school in Yokohama with her, plus these tiny ones, Adela and Frederick. And she's weighing up what's best to do for these children. But she's in Yokohama, and that she has decided that it is best for all of her children to be in Southampton rather than with her in Yokohama. So I'm imagining that she has got on the boat with Walter and James, who are ready for school, so they'd be going to boarding school, and they are in school aged 6 and 4 in Southampton. And then there's Adela and Frederick, who are placed with this foster family. I can't begin to imagine what she felt like making that decision, that they would be better off, not with her. If we're thinking about how Yokohama was, it doesn't sound like I don't think she's happy there. And I can imagine that she thinks it's better for the children not to be there, not to be with her. But it would have been an exceedingly difficult decision for her. In those days, they wouldn't have had the understanding about what happens about attachment, and that, if we have a good attachment with our care providers, parents, or whatever, how beneficial that is, and if it's disrupted, how difficult that can be. And this is one of the areas that I've been looking into, because I've known, it's like I said yesterday, I've known about the fact that she was left behind for a long time because her niece wrote this chronicle, and this was one of the things that she wrote about. It's only recently that I've come to see a greater significance in it for her. And that I think this separation from her mother had a profound and lasting impact upon her. So one of the things that I looked at, which is online, about parent-child separation. Parent-child separation causes significant stress and emotional distress in children. Evolutionarily, children are wired to perceive separation from their parents as a matter of life and death. And you could imagine that at age 3, she hasn't got the capacity to understand why she's being left behind or how long it's going to be for. And of course, it's going to be for at least over a year, isn't it? Because for her mother to go back might take 4 to 6 months. And then when she comes back, it's going to be another 4 to 6 months. So it's going to be over a year. And again, prolonged separation takes a toll on children's physical and cognitive development. It depletes their bodies, impairs their brain function, leads to long-term detrimental effects on their mental and physical health. Such separation threatens crucial attachments. And it's particularly significant in the early years of life when the brain is developing rapidly but lacks the cognitive capacity to understand the reasons for separation. As a result, children may form false beliefs about themselves, their parents, and the world. And we'll come back to that because one of her other early childhood experiences, I think, definitely relates to that. So I think it has a profound effect on her and her ability or inability to trust people as she grows up and to form good relationships. She finds it very difficult to form trusting relationships as she grows up. And I think it must be connected with this. She does also record an early spiritual experience that she has whilst she's living with the Barretts. She describes this in one of her published works. She doesn't say it's about her, but it has to be. Well, I'll read some of it and you can see what you think. But when she was only 4 or 5, she was taken by devout foster parents to the Baptist chapel in Southampton for an evening service of adult baptism, at which a large number of men and women were immersed in a great tank sunk in the platform. This made an indelible impression in the child's soul of breathless awe and unspeakable wonder about God. And although not one word or act of the service had been understood, the parable in action remained throughout life as an inexhaustible lesson on the mysteries of death and resurrection. It's her. I'm sure it is. Speaking from her own experience. But I also wonder whether, not necessarily the Barretts, but I think from other things that she says that about even children having a sense of a great burden of sin, experience a great burden of sin. I think she's relating that to herself. That's her own experience too as a young child. I don't know whether that's something that she's exposed to in her time with the Barretts. It might have been. And a judgmental image of God. I think she's growing up with that as well. So then, moving on, age 6, and she has clearly been brought back to Japan by this time, because here she is travelling back to the UK once again. And this is another memory that she recounted to her nieces, Phil and Eve, many years later. I've adapted the beginning and the ending slightly. So the mother was on a boat with her 3 youngest children. The oldest, who was Adela, was a 6-year-old girl. They were travelling from Japan, where the family business was based, to the UK, as the pregnant mother wished to give birth to her 10th child in England. The sailing ship ran into a violent storm not far from Japan, and the captain ordered everyone on deck and put on their life jackets to be ready to take to the lifeboats. It was night time, and the 3 little children were sleeping peacefully. When a sailor banged on the cabin door, ordering all on deck, the mother, looking at her sleeping children and knowing that she, being pregnant, could not survive long enough to save them, locked the cabin door and decided they all go down with the ship. However, the ship weathered the storm, and in the morning, the 6-year-old, Adela, was found standing on a coil of rope with a group of sailors squatted on the deck listening to her as she read to them from the Bible. So, I wonder what strikes you about that story. Clearly, the travel was hazardous. Harriet, I think, clearly is not happy in Japan. She doesn't want to give birth to another child. She's prepared to take all these children back with her so that she can be in Southampton. Perhaps her mother's still alive, for sure. Perhaps she wants her mother near her. What do we learn about Adela? Presumably, her mother told her this story because she was asleep when it all happened. So I wonder how that squared with her view of her mother. Also, isn't it interesting, she's taking on the role of teacher at that young age with the sailors. And I think it's significant that it's the Bible that she teaches from. A complaint that she had later in life was that they had no toys as a children. She thinks possibly her mother had a very poverty-stricken background. Her mother probably had no toys herself and perhaps didn't realise the lack. The only thing that they had was the Bible. So the Bible has become important to her already, and we'll see more about that later. So the third glimpse is when she's aged 10. I'm afraid this isn't a happy story either. It's tough, isn't it? Her life is tough. And she shows some resilience, I think, to survive. And with this story from her, when she's aged 10, I think we get a glimpse into how she is managing to survive, how she is interpreting what's happening to her. And it kind of fits in with, the damage that was done with the early separation. So she didn't publish this. This was a scrap of handwritten autobiography that I found in a notebook that either we had from quite a while ago, or Jeremy J has been bringing things over. So Jeremy is Adela's great nephew. He's the son of Eve. So Phil and Eve were the nieces, and he is the son of Eve, and he still lives next door. So he's gradually been bringing stuff over, especially as you know, I'm sort of obsessed by it all. This scrap of handwritten autobiography, again, she doesn't say me and my. She's writing it in the third person, but it is her. And in this, Adela describes a young girl in mid-November. Adela's birthday was the 21st of November. Being awake at midnight at the end of the day of her 10th birthday. She was in the back room of a little house near Southampton with a baby of 18 months in a wicker cradle next to her, and on the other side of the room, a frail little woman of 80 slumbered uneasily in a comfortless armchair. So this is me talking, not now her. The baby could have been Mabel, that last child that was born to Harriet and William, the one who was born in Southampton. There's a little bit of discrepancy about the ages, but I'm not sure that Adela is completely accurate about ages. It's more rough. I think that is Mabel. And the old woman sitting by the fire was almost certainly their grandmother. This is Harriet's mother, Mary. And the main point of the story was the 10-year-old's realisation that by the end of her birthday, no one but she had remembered that it was her 10th birthday. And the description she gives of the range of emotions and thoughts of the sensitive child certainly resonates with Adela's known character. This is what Adela says. She's the 10-year-old child now. Humour, faint but grim, twitched the sensitive nostrils as she registered the fact that any birthday but hers would have received some kind of honourable mention. Yet, at the same time, with that rare instinct for exactness, which was to be at once the blessing and bane of all her days, she also recognised the subtle compliment implied in the oversight, for it meant that she was not counted amongst the children from whom the serious and painful things of life must be hidden, or at least disguised by make-believe, gaiety over such trifles as a birthday. So, what's going on here? Well, I think the family is in trouble if no one remembers it's her birthday. I think there's big trouble going on. And this incident is clearly feeding into her sense that she's growing up with, that on the one hand, the adults in her life cannot be trusted to be there for her, and also that her feelings are not important. This is something that came out of the research I was reading, that children may internalise the ideas that their needs and desires are unimportant, and that their parents cannot be relied upon to care for them, and that the world is a dangerous place full of untrustworthy people. And then there's in a pamphlet that she published in 1939, and it's really interesting how her life keeps coming through these publications, which aren't about her. So this one is Studies in the Collect, Epistle and Gospel, where she wrote about the prayers and the readings that were set by the Anglican Church for each Sunday of the year, according to the Book of Common Prayer. So it's in one of these that this extract comes from. The child, so in this pamphlet she writes of the child who for its first 10 years has never known the protecting clasp, the cherishing look, the comforting kiss or the endearing word, but has been familiar with terror by day and by night, may be saved many pitfalls in afterlife from the illusions of self-importance, and can easily learn detachment from the attractions and repulsions of personality as a discipline of preparation for the initiation into the truth of love, which only Christ can give to those who will follow him at all costs. I think she's talking about her own background. Her own first 10 years were pretty grim, and that, yes, she easily learnt detachment because the adults around her, she grew up with a sense they couldn't be trusted. So you don't attach yourself to people who you feel can't be there for you. And I think this detachment is a word that is certainly related to her. Interestingly, it's the word that she uses, or she used when she spoke to Phil and Eve about her mother, that her mother was strangely detached from her children. Maybe that's how Harriet could survive being separated from her children. And also her little brother, Edwin, who actually came here and lived here for a bit during the 30s. Adela herself described Edwin as a curious, calm, detached person. So there we are. What a start. So I'm pretty convinced that her early background had profound implications for her adult life, her personality, her outlook in life, and that as she was growing up, she was looking for something. And this is where, so this afternoon, I'll come on to New Thought, because I really believe that for her, New Thought offered good news from this really hard, tough life where she'd had to tell herself, that at age 10, she shouldn't matter about birthdays, her feelings shouldn't matter, because that way of sort of surviving what's happening to her. And I think also, if your big humans can't be there for you, or you experience them in that way, I think you're more inclined, and there is a bit of evidence for this, you can be more inclined to find what you need in God. Don't rely on humans who can't do it for you. You can turn to God, and some sense of needing a predictable and reliable God. And the God that is offered through New Thought operates by laws. So not a sort of a random, well, God might do this, God might do that if you're lucky, but this is how God operates in the world. And I think that was part of the good news for her. This is a God that you can rely on to do what God says they will do. So this is the last picture that we have, the earliest picture that we have of Adela, yes? So Adela is the young woman who's probably in her teens. Her mother Harriet is in the middle, and her next brother Frederick, the one who was the nurse child with her, he's the young man standing up. So we know that, we could tell that Harriet wasn't happy in Yokohama, and eventually she left permanently, the mother, and by 1881, Harriet, the mother, is in England, but she's working as a servant. She's a nurse living with a family in London, and all the children of school age, Adela included, are in a boarding school in Devon. So, one of the children in later life did say that their father refused to support the family back in England. I mean, I think he must have supported them through boarding school, but what I can imagine happened was that when Harriet said, I don't want to live in Yokohama anymore, he said, if you go back, I'm not going to support you, because otherwise, why would she be working as a servant, basically, in someone else's house? So even though, and I think possibly what triggers her return is that all the time that her mother, the grandmother who you saw the picture of, all the time that Mary is alive, Harriet could be thinking, well, at least the children who are in Southampton do have family close, who, however, sort of rough and ready it is, they're prepared to look out for the children. But then Mary dies in 1879. And I think that's probably the final straw for Harriet. She decides she's going to come back. Her husband says, if you do, I won't support you. She gets this job as a nurse with a family. So even though she's back, she can't provide a family home for her children, who are all in the boarding school. So it's tough. It's tough for Harriet, and it's tough for the children, because I don't know what they would have done in school holidays, stayed at the school, presumably. So I just wanted to bring that up to date, because that was and I imagine, because Adela didn't realise, she didn't know until she was much, much older what was happening. And she certainly had resentments towards her mother, possibly about, not giving them a family home or not being with them. She didn't understand, what the situation was. But I'm very happy if people have got questions or responses to what you've heard this morning. So over to you, if you've got anything you'd like to ask or say.
How was the lack of parenting she had? How common was that amongst Victorian families at that time?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Dave. And I was just saying, as I was coming over with Claire, I think there would have been families, like if you're in the more middle class family, and say you've got a job in the Indian Civil Service or something like that, it's more in what your family does. You would have children back here in boarding school, and it would have been sort of what you did. So I don't know how many, but I think perhaps for some it was part of the family expectation right from the start. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what you think. Whereas I think for Harriet, it was completely outside her experience of, how you live. And being pioneers, I think, if you went to the Indian Civil Service or something, there was a structure there in place already. Whether it was right or wrong is another matter. But, there was, whereas it was all brand new. And they had to have the army there to enable them to live there. I think it's interesting that Adela became a pioneer in her own way with the communities that she founded, and sort of ploughing her very particular furrow through life. I think, and it was Robin, Tony's wife, who helped me make this connection, so Adela was in Japan for part of her childhood. There was this toing and froing, and she would have seen her father and presumably other white Western men doing pioneering stuff, trying things out for the first time. And perhaps, it was part of the family makeup, or she saw that, this was what you could do. So that the pioneering element was there, and taking risks. Adela took big risks, big financial risks as well. Oh yes, and so when her parents separated, I don't know whether it was before or after or whatever, but her father, they didn't get a divorce, but he lived with a Japanese woman. They had a daughter, and they emigrated to China. He became bankrupt. So I think that's partly why they left. But also we can see that, Japan was a hostile place, not surprisingly, a hostile place for white Westerners.
Do you know how much contact she maintained with her siblings?
That's a really interesting question. And one thing that we will pick up on is, I think, for quite a while, maybe Mabel was the only one that she kept in regular touch with. So Mabel is the youngest one. And I think, so they were the youngest daughters. So Mabel was the little baby in the cradle when Adela was remembering her birthday, but no one else did. There was clearly a complete break in communication with her sister Clara for many years that, for reasons that we will discover tomorrow, they re-established a good writing relationship. And one of her brothers, Edwin, so her youngest brother, actually lived here for a few months in the 30s. So when she was writing to Clara, there was this picture of their brother Alfred, who'd had this picture taken when he was aged 80. And Adela says, I would never have recognised him. It's 57 years since I last saw him. And, I mean, they never would see each other. He was still in Japan. Clara was in America. She'd emigrated to America. The very oldest daughter, Emma Eliza, she'd emigrated to America. The sons tended, on the whole, they went into trade like their father, went back to Japan, but then Edwin went to China and then South Africa. Frederick went to China. Unfortunately, he drowned in his 40s there. His family ended up going to Australia. Mabel went to New Zealand. Adela was the only one who actually stayed in this country. They were spread across the world. So she kept in touch with Alfred, with Clara, must have kept in touch with Edwin because he came, and Mabel's family. Mabel, unfortunately, developed something, possibly epilepsy, that meant that she ended up in a mental hospital for, well, the last 30 years of her life. She was the mother of Phil and Eve, who came and lived here. So it was a widespread family, and perhaps it's not surprising that they didn't have close links. I was just thinking about those 5 that had been born after the family moved to Yokohama. And it may just be unfortunate coincidence, but James, I don't know how, but he died when he was 20. Then there was Adela. Then there was Frederick. He was the one who drowned in China in his 40s. Then there was Edwin. He lived a reasonable length, probably lived into his 80s. Mabel developed epilepsy. It may just be coincidence, but they didn't have a brilliant time.
She didn't really know her elder siblings because she would have met them till she was.
Yes, that's right. How much contact she had with them is very questionable. You're quite right. So Clara, who's 6 years older than Adela, when Adela and Frederick and Edwin and Mabel were all in the boarding school in Devon, Clara was a music teacher at the school. So I think that, there was a bit of connection there. But yeah, the older Alfred and George and Walter probably didn't have much to do with them. And I think it was because they shared something of faith that she kept in touch with Alfred and Clara, and I guess Edwin, who stayed here, because her way of keeping in touch, I think, was to send her books to people. And if they weren't interested, then she didn't really have anything else to say. I think that was probably the case. Because what happened with Clara was, so years before, apparently Clara had sent, requesting her books. She'd sent them, never heard anything back, assumed that they weren't wanted, so didn't keep up the contact. And then it was like 20 years later when they did make contact again.
Do you know anything about the boarding school that they were at?
Well, I have discovered something unfortunate about the school they were at. I'm not sure that they would have been at the school in Devon for very long, because it was reported that there was an outbreak of one of those infectious diseases that goes through schools. So they would have gone there. I think it was a Baptist couple who ran it. I think that was important for Harriet, that, you know, there was some sort of religious background, faith background. I don't know how long they were there for, but there was this incident that was reported in the newspapers about the same time. But there's another school where she gets school prizes from, but I can't find anything about the school. So I think there were lots of schools that kind of sprang up, you know, were there for a bit and then, you know, disappeared and haven't left any trace, apart from these school prizes.
You said, and I accept what you say, that not being able to trust adults very easily, trusting God became even more important. But I also heard it said that if you can't trust adults, how can you trust God?
Yes, indeed. It doesn't automatically follow, does it?
No, there must be other factors that make a difference.
Yes. So, as far as I'm aware, her family was Church of England. So they would have been baptised. So the older ones were baptised in, and the family had a connection with St Mary's in Southampton. And then certainly James and almost certainly the others would have been baptised in the English church, the Anglican church in Yokohama. She does write in another couple of places about her experience as a teenager, church experience as a teenager, which is interesting. One of them, she talks about, so both of these come from in the late 20s. She was sending out Bible notes. I don't know how often. She's sending out Bible notes to quite a lot of people. And she began by going through the Bible, taking the gospel. She would put what happened in the four different gospels, she'd put it together in a sort of what she felt was a chronology, and then she'd write about them and send them out. In one of those, she talks about how she was at a church in Cobham in Surrey, and how at the age of 15 or 16, she found the sermons very testing of patience, because they were so poor. But that Matthew Arnold was also in the congregation, and how serene he seemed to be as he was listening to these. And she took him as, people she's writing to, she took him as an example of what to do, rather than her own example of, you know, feeling sort of irritated. So Matthew Arnold was a poet and very well known in the... And Thomas Arnold's son. Thomas Arnold wrote Tom Brown's School Days and was a headmaster, that sort of thing. So that was one. And then the other one, she talked about receiving confirmation lessons at St Mary's in Southampton from the vicar, Basil Wilberforce. So related, I think he was a grandson of William Wilberforce, and she was in the adult group. She was 15, again, she was 15 or 16. She was in the adult group because she was so advanced for her years. Well, I think she was very intelligent, but also if you've had to tell yourself to grow up from the age of 10 at least, you know, you're putting childish things away from a very early age. And the complaint she makes about that is that in all those confirmation classes, Basil Wilberforce never mentioned healing in any shape or form. And for her, with her her sort of grounding in New Thought, she felt that healing, spiritual healing, was one of the key things. And, you know, she felt that churches were letting people down by not telling them about it, you know, that it's one of those, it's a possibility. The really interesting thing about Basil Wilberforce is that he then went on to become Dean of Westminster and came into contact with New Thought in London. And we'll see this afternoon the Higher Thought Centre in Kensington. That's not Adela's centre, it's the centre that was established before she did a centre. Basil Wilberforce went there because he met other people to do with New Thought there. Higher Thought is the title that some English people gave New Thought. It's almost, I mean, what's the likelihood that Adela and Basil did not meet up in later life because of their interest in New Thought? He remained within the Church of England, but apparently New Thought was threaded through his sermons. You know, he was very open to much of what New Thought offered. Whereas I think we'll see that, you know, for Adela, she took a more, she separated herself from mainstream church because, well, yeah, I mean, she was a woman. Basil had his career in the church, so, you know.
It's the same with Marianne Dunlop, of course.
Yes, and we'll, yes, yeah. Hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about her this afternoon as well. So I'm not an expert on this, but I think it is easier for people who have a good attachment with their parents or their care providers than to think God can be a safe being for them. What's interesting is that there is a bit of research that suggests there's a link between mysticism and having a less resolved attachment with caregivers, which I thought is really interesting because, Adela describes herself as a mystic. So what my sense is that she did have some sort of, more than a sort of, but she did have, God was important, but she was growing up with this weight of sin and judgment that she'd taken on in childhood, and so it was that kind of view of God that she had at that time.
Yeah, of course it changed.
And it changed, yes. And it was her being influenced by New Thought that helped it to change. Yes, I mean, the sort of attachment theory, that's one of those rabbit holes that I thought, well, I need to know more about this. Oh.